But let us for a moment leave these great works and glance at their author. I visited Humboldt, said Professor Leiber in his eloquent address before the New York Geographical Society. I visited Humboldt at Potsdam in the year 1844, when he had reached therefore the age of 75. For you know that he was born in the memorable year 1769, in which Cuvier was born, and Wellington, and Chateaubriand, and Napoleon, and Canning, and Walter Scott, and Mackintosh. Just 10 years after Schiller, and 20 years after Goethe. Humboldt told me at the time that he was engaged in a work which intended to call Cosmos. That he had obliged chiefly to write at night, for in the morning he studied and arranged materials, and in the evening he was expected to be with the king from 9 to about 11. After his return from the king, he was engaged in writing until 1 or 2 o'clock. Humboldt, when in Berlin or Potsdam, was retained, if we may use a professional term, to join the evening circle of the king for the indicated hours. I believe he was expected actually to perform in return for titles and honors and revenue, which he enjoying, except that the monarch sometimes selected him as a companion on his journeys. Humboldt described to me the character of these royal evening reunions. Everything of interest as the day brought it to notice was therefore discussed. The drawing of a beautiful live oak near Charleston, which a fair friend had made for me, was taken by Humboldt to that circle, where it attracted so much attention that he begged me to leave it. And he told me that the volume describing our aqueduct, which my friend, the author, now the president of our college, had given me at the time of its publication, and which I had sent him, had furnished the topic of discussion for an entire week. We collected, he said, all possible works on ancient and modern aqueducts, and compared and discussed and applied for many successive evenings. Is there, then, a royal road to knowledge after all, when a Humboldt can be retained? May I extend your supposed permission of giving me personal anecdotes, provided they are sufficiently biographical character, such as Plutarch perhaps would not have disdained to record? I desire to show what interest he took in everything he connected with progress. I have reason to believe that it was chiefly owing to him that the King of Prussia offered me, not long after my visit, a chair to be created in the University of Berlin, exclusively dedicated to the science and art of publishment, or to peonology. I had conversed with the monarch on the superiority of solitary confinement and labor over all the prison systems. Then he concluded our interview with these words: I wished you would convince Mr. von Humboldt of your views. He is rather opposed to them. I shall let him know that you will see him. Humboldt in prison discipline sounded strange to my ears. I went and found that he loved truth better than his own opinion or bias, and my suggestion was so comprehensive. A university as that of Berlin, our common native city, ought to have been honored with having the first chair of peonology, for which it was high time to carve out a distinct branch, treating of the convict and his phrases after the act of conviction was seized upon once by his liberal mind. He soon carried the minister of justice along with him, and the offer to which I have alluded was the consequence. On the other hand, a friend whose name is perhaps more interwoven with the history of our canal than that of any other citizen except Clinton, informs me that he had the pleasure of sitting by the side of Humboldt at a royal dinner at Charlottenburg. During the whole time they were engaged in conversing almost exclusively on our great canal, and that greater one which ought to unite in everlasting wedlock the sturdy Atlantic, the teeming Pacific, having now yearned for one another for centuries. Humboldt spoke with a knowledge of detail and a sagest discernment which were surpassing to my friends, well versed in the details of all these topics. Although it has been stated by high authority that the works of Humboldt show to everyone who can read between the lines and endeavor to present nature in her totality, unconnected with man, I cannot otherwise than state here that, on the contrary, it has never appeared to me that this great man, studying nature in her details and becoming what Bacon calls her interpreting priest, he elates himself to those heights whence he can take a comprehensive view of her in connection with man and the movements of society, with language, economy, and exchange, institutions, and architecture, which is to man almost like the nidifying instinct to the bird. Humboldt's tendency in this respect to me in its sphere not wholly dissimilar to the view which his friend Ryder takes of geography in connection with history. Some 15 years ago, continued Professor Leiber, after speaking of a friend which he made to William von Humboldt at Tegel. Some 15 years ago, Humboldt presided over the annual meeting of naturalists that held at Berlin. In his opening speech, he chiefly discoursed on the merits of Linnaeus. He knew of Linnaeus as Herodotus knew of Salamis and Thermopylae. For the life of the great Swede overlapped by 10 years that of Humboldt, and all there said of Linnaeus seemed to me to apply to himself with far greater force and on a large scale. In the speech, too, I remember he quoted his friend Schiller. Humboldt was, in a marked manner, of a poetic temperament. I do not believe that without it he would have been able to receive those willing impressions of nature, and to combine what was singularly received in those vivid transcriptions, and in a language so true and transparent that they surprise the visitor of the scenes to this day. He had that constructive imagination. I do not speak now of inventive fancy, without which no man can be great in any branch, whether it belong to nature or to history. But yesterday, an officer of our navy, whose profession has made him well acquainted with South America by sea and land, and with the Andes, one of the mountains of our illustrious man, told me that he knew of no descriptions, or rather characteristics, so true to living reality as Humboldt's views of nature, which he had pursued and enjoyed on the spot. The power of collocation and shrewdness of connection, the knowledge of detail and absence of desire to perceive things according to a system, and thirst for knowledge of the life of nature, and the constant wish to make all of us share in the treasures of his knowledge, his lucid style, which may raise his cosmos to a German classic, which seemed to me to characterize Humboldt in his studies of nature. Besides all that which he had done was as a professional naturalist. Humboldt's name and life may be deemed with strict property of language international. He read and spoke with strict propriety of language. English and Italian he spoke, and he wrote Spanish with ease, correctness, and French almost as well as German. He lived for an entire period of many years in Paris and counted many French among his best friends, yet not at the expense of patriotism. In that very speech at Berlin, which had been mentioned, he dwells with pleasure on the penetrating effects which the German mind has exercised on all the physical sciences, no less than the mental branches. Humboldt was a dweller in his kingly palaces, a courtier if you chose, and the son of a courtier without taint of servile flattery or of submission. He was rather the honored guest of royalty. He loved liberty and considered it a necessary element of our civilization. He was a sincere friend of substantial institutional freedom. His mind often traveled to his country, and that he loved America, sometimes with sadness, is sufficiently shown, where it was not otherwise well known, by the singular love which the Americans bore him. To me, that little piece of news was inexpressibly touching, which simply informed us that our minister in Berlin, with the Americans now present at that city, a cluster of mourners from afar, formed part of his funeral procession, the only foreign nation thus represented. In his simplicity and genial warmth, he did what many a bold man would have hesitated to do. I was present at a young and distant listener when at Rome, immediately after the Congress of Verona, the King of Prussia, Humboldt, and Niebuhr conversed on the affairs of the day, and when the last mentioned spoke in no flattering terms of the political views and antecedents of Arago, who, it is well known, was a very advanced Republican of the Galician school, an uncompromising French Democrat, Fred William III, simply abominated republicanism. Yet, when Niebuhr had finished, Humboldt said with a sweetness that I vividly remember, "Still, this monster and his dearest friend I have in France." Humboldt had all his brother's views of the necessity of the highest of university education and of the widest possible popular education, and he gave impulse to many a scientific, historical, or ethnological expedition, fitted out even by foreign governments, for he was considered the counselor of all. But I cannot dwell here any longer on his versatility and manifold aptitude. It is proved by the literature of almost every branch that if we read Barth on Central Africa, we find Humboldt. If we read Say's Political Economy, we find his name. If we study the history of the 19th century, we find his name in the diplomacy of Prussia and France. If we read the general literature, we find his name in connection with Schiller and Madame de Stael. If we look at modern maps, we find his isothermal lines. If we consult Grimm's Dictionary of the German language, we find Humboldt's as authority. That period has arrived to which Croesus alluded in the memorable exclamation, "O Salon, Salon, Salon." And we are now allowed to say that Humboldt was one of the most gifted, most fortunate, and most favored mortals. Favored even with the comeliness and a brow so exquisitely formed that irrespective of it being a symbol of lofty thought, it is pleasant to look upon in his bust as a mere beautiful thing. Favored even in his name, so easily uttered by all nations which were destined to pronounce it. When we pray not only for the kindly fruits of earth, but also, as we ought to do, for the kindly fruits of the mind, let us always gratefully remember that he who gave us all blessed things has given to our age and to our all posterity such a man as Humboldt. The publication of the narrative of the expedition to the Ural by Rose in 1837 to 42 and of Humboldt's Central Asia in 1843 gave the latter the leisure that he needed to begin the long-delayed Cosmos. To the publication of this work, which was to embody the substance of his lectures delivered at Berlin in 1828-29, Humboldt had in some committed to himself before starting on the Asiatic journey, as he remembered only the outlines of his lectures. There were 61 in all. The reader will remember that they were delivered without notes. He was obliged to go over the whole ground anew. He had begun to do so. We have already seen when Professor Leibel visited him in 1844, and from that time until within a few months of his death, he was engaged on this great undertaking. The idea of a work like Cosmos had been on his mind for nearly 50 years. It was as if it were the sun of his life, and through his lesser works might seem for a while to obscure it. Floating like clouds between it and the world of men, it was still like as radiant as ever, shining divinely in his limitless fragment of mind. One by one the clouds were drifted aside, the royal pavilions of his genius, rich with purple and gold, and in the calm sweet evening of his age, the world was enlightened as if it never had been before. Glorious old man, we love to think of thee and thy immortal task. We see that in thy study, the floor around thee pilled with books, the table before thee strewn with charts, the pen in thy figures flying over the sheets of white paper, as thou thinkest the thoughts of God, the divine conception that shaped the cosmos, the universal world poem, which thou art singing anew in thy grand old German tongue. Next to Milton, blind old poor, sitting at the door of his cottage in the sunshine, and dictating his long-delayed task, Paradise Lost. We know of no grander spectacle than the white-haired Humboldt writing Cosmos at midnight. The men were unlike in many things, one a dweller in kingly places, the other fallen on evil days and evil tongues. But both had served the world through a long life, and both on the threshold of death were serving it still. Each building a deathless poem, for Cosmos is a poem, though it lacks the jingle of rhythm. The first volume of Cosmos was published in 1845. The fifth and last in 1858, with the exception of a journey to Copenhagen in the former year, and an occasional visit to Paris. His last visit to the French capital was in October 1847. Humboldt spent the last twilight of the mellow evening of his life at Berlin, Potsdam, and Tegel. The preface to the first volume of Cosmos is dated from Potsdam, and the preface to the last edition of the Aspects of Nature from Berlin. He was visited at the former place in 1847 by Stephens, the distinguished American traveler recently deceased. Towards sunset on the 1st of July, says Mr. Stephens, the railroad cars from Hamburg brought me to the gate of Berlin. Entering the city, the twilight of a northern summer illuminated the stately houses and the broad avenue of Unter den Linden. Leaving the broad portal of Brandenburg Gates, with the car of victory on the top, carried off as a trophy by Napoleon, and 8 years of captivity restored to its palace, and riding on the other extremity to the avenue, I before me at one view of the Schlossplatz, or Palace Square, with the colossal palace and all the magnificent buildings of the city, all enlarged and made more grand by the mellow twilight, exhibiting an architecture splendor hardly to be met with in any capital in Europe. Turning off one side of the square at 9 o'clock, I was taking mind's ease in the salon at the Hotel de Russie. I had gone over in Washington, the pioneer of the American mail steamers, to Bremen, and was striking over the continent for a passo on the Rhine, and to intercept the steamer at Southampton on her return to New York. I had but one day for Berlin. There was but one object in it I had any special desire to see, and that was Humboldt. I might visit Berlin again, the other moments of the city would remain, but he might pass away. Early in the morning, I called upon Mr. Donaldson, our minister, and to my extreme regret, learned from him that Baron von Humboldt was with the king at Potsdam, 30 miles distant, in feeble health and unable to receive visitors. Fortunately, I had occasion to call upon Baron von Ronay, formerly Prussian minister to this country, and incidentally mentioned to him my disappointment and regret that he stopped me abruptly, and with friendly earnestness said that I must not leave Berlin without seeing Baron Humboldt. At the same time, looking at his watch, calling up my servants, telling him that the cars for Potsdam started at 12, and hastily writing a letter of introduction without allowing me time for acknowledgments. He hurried me off to my carriage. A brisk ride brought me to the depot just in time for the cars. 3/4 of an hour carried us to Potsdam, and before I had recovered from my surprise, I was at Baron von Humboldt's residence. It was in the royal palace, a stately and historic pile, once the residence of Frederick the Great, with his apartments remaining in the same state in which he had left them. One wing was just now occupied by a Baron Humboldt, and it seemed to a just tribute and right reward. A proper crowning of his fame, alike honorable to prince and subject. That after years of travel, of physical and intellectual labor, he should, in the evening of his days, return to the town in which he was born, to live in the royal palace, the guest and friend of his king.